Before we begin, I just want to make it clear that under no circumstances do I condone or believe that the behavior of Tyler Robinson is acceptable or normal, not in any way, shape, or form. My intention is to provide understanding, to help people to get a sense from a psychological perspective what might be happening and why it might be happening. In part, what this behavior speaks to are the dangers of a extremely polarized culture. When you have two sides that are extreme and that continue to become more extreme based on an equal and opposite reaction to the other,
the intention of justice is to see that the guilty people are proven guilty and that the innocent are freed. Only we have a problem here.
Welcome. This is the I Don't Belong Here show, and I am your host, Samantha Beningo. I am a behavioral scientist, career psychotherapist, a 6-year PhD candidate in clinical psychology, a master's level psychologist and counselor. And today we are going to be taking a look at the text messages of Tyler Robinson. Now, before we begin, I want to start by saying this is not a political discussion. I am only here to shed light on these text messages and to give you my professional opinion about whether they are valid or not, and to explain one way or the other why I feel that way. That is all I can do. I am simply here to use my professional expertise to shed further light on them. That is it. I should also tell you that I am not here doing a forensic or a clinical analysis of Tyler Robinson. We simply do not have enough information to do that kind of thorough assessment. Okay, here's what we know about Robinson so far. He is 22 years old. He was born and raised in Utah. He was not a student at Utah Valley University, but had been awarded a scholarship out of high school and attended Utah State University for 1 year before he moved home to complete an electrical apprenticeship program at Dixie Technical College. And I guess he grew up in St. George, Utah, which I believe to be southern Utah. At the time of the shooting, he was living in an apartment with his partner, a biological male who is transitioning to becoming a female. It appears that the family was not aware of their relationship. On paper, Robinson had not even voted in the last 2 elections. He was listed as unaffiliated in his official voter registration. His family were all registered Republicans. Grandma was quoted as saying, "I don't know any single one who's a Democrat in the family. I'm just so confused." Mom is a social worker. Dad is a police officer. And it was his parents who ultimately recognized him and convinced him to, I believe, turn himself in. Okay, so these text messages were alleged to be confiscated by investigators for the state of Utah.
Now, we also now know the charges that Robinson is facing, 7 counts in all, and they could mean that he will be put to death if he's found guilty in a jury trial.
It's worth mentioning that the Attorney General has not ruled out a firing squad.
Prosecutors in Utah County announced them today for the first time at a news conference.
Count 1, aggravated murder, a capital offense for intentionally or knowingly causing the death of Charlie Kirk under circumstances that created a great risk of death to others. Count 2, felony discharge of a firearm causing serious bodily injury, a first-degree felony. The state is further alleging aggravating factors on counts 1 and 2 because the defendant is believed to have targeted Charlie Kirk based on Charlie Kirk's political expression and did so knowing that children were present and would witness the homicide.
For the sake of time, we won't go through all of them, but just note that some of these charges are directly related to these text messages, to some of what Robinson has said in these text messages, and that he was trying to get the roommate to delete these messages to obstruct justice.
Now, that roommate's been identified as a member of the transgender community, a man who's transitioning to be a woman, and they had been in a relationship with Robinson. Robinson is facing 2 counts of obstruction of justice for allegedly trying to stop that roommate from speaking to law enforcement and for allegedly telling the roommate to delete messages about the shooting. Now, I want to be clear that law enforcement has said that this roommate has been very cooperative in the investigation and they are not facing charges at this time.
Police interviewed Robinson's roommate, a biological male who was involved in a romantic relationship with Robinson.
This is how they read. So on September 10th, 2025, Tyler Robinson sends a text to his roommate, who is alleged to also be his lover. It says, "Drop what you are doing and look under my keyboard." The note then reads, "I had the opportunity to take out Charlie Kirk, and I'm going to take it." Now, right off the bat, we can assume a few things based on this exchange. First, that Tyler Robinson intended to communicate this message ahead of time to the roommate. And you're going to see how later on, and pretty quickly, that contradicts some of what he says in just a few seconds. So we're going to get the message at several points throughout these texts that Tyler Robinson contradicts himself, that he had one intention, one stated intention, and then that he does something very different. And that by itself gives us a lot of information about Tyler Robinson. So there's a note apparently under the keyboard, under his keyboard in their shared living space. And it says, "I had the opportunity to take out Charlie Kirk, and I'm going to take it." Now, the way that this is written, "I had the opportunity," which implies urgency. Now, there are 4 basic ingredients, if you will, to motivation, or why it is that we do or don't do something. Whether we know it or not, every decision that we make is compelled by sort of 4 basic components. And only one of them is desire. And that makes sense because there are plenty of things that we do every single day that we don't want to do. Like, I may not feel like doing the laundry. I don't desire doing laundry, but I have to do it, so I do it anyway. And particularly if, let's say, the next day I have something, I'm going to school, I'm going to a party, a work event, and I want to make sure I have a certain outfit that I can wear. That's going to create urgency. That's going to increase the likelihood that we're going to take some action because we feel a sense of urgency. If you've ever gone to, let's say, a clothing retail outfit online, and they have like a ticker on the top of the screen that gives you the countdown for when the sale is going to end, that is very intentional. That's very much on purpose, because they understand that if there's a sense of urgency for us, if we know that the sale is going to end, that it's going to be more likely we take the action to make the purchase. So urgency is an important component of motivation. It's not always present. And in that case, oftentimes desire, there's no urgency, there's no time sensitive reason to take an action, but there's a desire, like I really want to do that thing, right? So urgency can often offset motivation. And for example, if we are working with families, if I'm working with parents who are trying to figure out how do I help motivate my child, we might talk to them about ways that they can create urgency to increase the likelihood that their child is going to make some positive choice to do something. So the fact that he is including urgency in this statement is important. He's saying, I saw an opportunity, meaning there was a time-sensitive window where he felt that he was going to be able to execute this task, And that is what largely motivated the behavior. That checks out. That is very aligned with basic human behavior. And just keep that in mind as we go forward. But it also implies, because he uses the word take out, that he doesn't see Charlie Kirk like a person, that he sort of characterized him or caricatured him, made him sort of a thing. And that's a way that we would put distance between ourselves and this person so that we feel less guilty about taking some action to harm them, right? That also tells us that this is not a sociopath. This is not somebody who feels no emotion or no empathy for other people, because he's actively looking for a way to distance himself from guilt or shame or any negative emotion that he might take on at the idea of harming somebody to the point of taking their lives, right? Okay. So then the roommate writes back, "What? You're joking, right?" And then Tyler Robinson writes, "I'm still okay, my love, but I'm stuck in Orem for a little while longer yet." So this is interesting because the first thing that Tyler Robinson does here is assume that the roommate is going to be worried about him, about his well-being, about his safety, right? Not about the fact that somebody else was just murdered. And that's an interesting sort of testament to his thinking, Tyler Robinson's thinking. And then it says, "But I'm stuck in Orem, wherever the shooting happened, for a little while longer. Shouldn't be long until I can come home. But I got to grab my rifle still. To be honest, I had hoped to keep this secret till I died of old age. I'm sorry to involve you." So you'll see how this statement about wanting to keep this a secret until I died of old age really doesn't comport with the idea that he left a note under his keyboard for the roommate, specifically so that he could tell the roommate if he wanted to, right? So that's really telling about Tyler Robinson, that on one hand, he's saying, I had wanted to keep this a secret, right? And he says, to be honest, that often, when we say that we're trying to be honest, when we make it a point to be honest or to say to be honest, sometimes it insinuates that we're overcompensating for that statement not entirely being true. Because let's look at this more broadly. It's safe to say that if I say anything, my intention is that the other person thinks I'm being honest, right? So we might think that we are making it a point to overemphasize something when we say to be honest. We really want that person to know that we mean it. But oftentimes, when we choose that very specific phrase, it's because we're not entirely sure that we mean it, right? So this is something that if you do a lot of deception detection, you're going to look for. It's going to stand out to you. It often is indicative of that person not being honest. Now, I don't think that Tyler Robinson is trying to be dishonest with his partner, with his roommate, but I do think that it probably is more indicative of him not being sure. So what that tells us is that he was ambivalent. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to keep it a secret or not. Okay. Then he says, "I'm sorry to involve you," which again, we can kind of take with a grain of salt. It indicates to us that that was one of the reasons why he was ambivalent about keeping it a secret, that he wasn't sure whether it would be harming his roommate, who he says he cares a lot about, or says that he loves, that, he probably was very unsure, very conflicted about whether or not to tell his roommate. Now, why would you do that? The unselfish act here would be not to tell this person that he says he loves, because of course it makes them an accomplice to a very, very serious crime. But on the other hand, somebody who's motivated by an action like this doesn't want to keep it a secret. And especially from what we're going to see in the next few texts, it would make sense why Tyler Robinson did not want to keep it a secret, why he very specifically would want his roommate, a person he loves and who he wants to be thought of highly in the eyes of, why he wouldn't keep it a secret. Does that make sense? Okay. So, you weren't the one who did it, right? And then there's a full confession. I'm sorry. So again, this speaks to the conflict that we see right off the bat between I wanted to keep it a secret, and then right away I'm confessing to this person that I love, who I'm saying I wasn't sure whether I wanted to bring them into this because I realize I'm making them an accomplice to a crime. So not only do we have this full confession with I am, then we also have this I'm sorry. And we have to stop and ask, what are you sorry for? Right? Why does he say, I'm sorry? The other thing that is very clear that I need to mention, and it's almost shocking about this person's character, Tyler Robinson, is that there's no impulse control. There's no impulse control. There's no ability to have an urge and then sit with it without acting on it. And one thing that you can be sure of, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, is that although we might think of our children as adults when they get to be 20, 21, although in our system, our criminal justice system, we consider people adults sometimes at 13, and we are charging them for crimes that are very serious. The truth is that the human brain is not fully developed until we're 25 years old. And the most interesting thing about that is that the part of the brain that develops last is the part responsible for your best thinking, or what in psychology we might refer to as executive function.
And the area I want to show you is this anterior or front aspect of the frontal lobe called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for some of the most important tasks that define who we are. It handles planning, decision making, and even impulse control, we'll say, like emotional outbursts when someone cuts you off in traffic. Now, what's also interesting is that the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until our mid-20s. And this gradual development helps to explain why teenagers and young adults may struggle more with long-term planning and impulse control.
It's also why people are much more likely to take up arms and join the service before the age of 25. It's also why, many crimes are often committed before a person is old enough to have that frontal cortex fully online yet. And that's important. The other thing that occurs at this age, particularly for biological males, is they get this crazy surge of testosterone.
Testosterone is what you secrete when your status is being challenged. Testosterone makes people cocky and impulsive, and it makes it more likely that you'll do the behaviors needed to hold on to your status. If you're a baboon, if somebody is challenging your high rank, the appropriate response on your part is going to be aggression. But then you get to humans. And humans have lots of different ways of achieving or maintaining status. Take people in a circumstance, say playing an economic game, where you get status by being trustworthy and being generous in your interactions with the game. If you give people testosterone, does that make them more generous? And that's absolutely the case. Totally cool finding.
Now, testosterone is really interesting, though we think about it mostly as kind of like the aggressor, right? That's very much cultural. In other words, if in our culture what was rewarded was being loving and kind, if that was the way that we were able to better kind of influence our flock, then you would likely see testosterone take on that role. It would increase somebody's desire and willingness to be altruistic and kind and loving. So it's a really interesting kind of hormone that also acts along with your neurotransmitter system, and then of course influences our behavior. But it's the reason why, if you think back to like maybe when you were that age, maybe a teenager, or the idea of like the Romeo and Juliet kind of intense, passionate love, where the highs are so high and the lows are so low. And you maybe think back on those days and go, oh, I would love to feel that way again about somebody. Well, the truth is that why we feel that way is largely because of the way hormones are operating at that time in our lives, right? Our body is still just developing and learning how to react to the world around us, learning about who we are, how we want to be. So while I'm not making excuses at all, I'm a very big advocate for taking responsibility for our actions, no matter what they are. So I'm not giving you an excuse for the behavior. I'm simply explaining why it would be this way, right? Like, it does make sense because, this is how humans are designed at this age in life, right? You might think, well, yeah, but he was 22 or 23. He was close to 25. Well, yeah, but 2 years is a long time, particularly for this frontal part of your brain, this prefrontal cortex that is involved with good decision making and self-control, the ability to delay gratification, to manage our impulses, and to manage our emotions. So this is the part of your brain. Let's say that you might want to beat somebody up. You're at a bar and somebody looks at you the wrong way. You're at a sporting event and somebody threatens you. Your instinct might be to fight, right? To want to beat their ass. But there's a part of your brain that says, look, it's not worth it. Let's not do this here. You don't want to end up with an assault charge. So there's that smart part of you that comes in and says it's not worth it. Road rage is another example of that. But for somebody who's does not have a mature prefrontal cortex, they just don't have that yet. They really don't. And then all kinds of other systems will kind of, chip in to try to offset the fact that that hasn't come online yet. But emotions are experienced much more intensely. And because of that, you're a lot more likely to make what seems like a great decision to you at the time, but is just like the worst decision that as an adult you would regret forever, right? And it does make sense given the age and stage of development that Tyler Robinson is in, that he would be kind of caught in this dynamic, right? That emotions could really get the best of him because of the intensity of those emotions. So keep that in mind as we are traversing through the rest of these text messages. Okay, so then it says, I thought they caught the person, and Tyler says, no, they grabbed some crazy old dude, then interrogated someone in similar clothing. I had planned to grab my rifle from my drop point shortly after, but most of that side of town got locked down. It's quiet, almost enough to get out, but there's one vehicle lingering. All right, so this is interesting. Now, what we're going to start to see from Tyler Robinson is that he's answering his roommate, his partner's questions, but he's also sort of singularly now focusing on getting the rifle. And then we're going to learn why in just a bit. But that's really important. We also get the sense, and this is absolutely baffling and really a testimony to that immature development, that he believes at this point that he's going to get away with it, right? He talks about, I'll be home to you soon. So there was a real thought in the beginning, I'll be home to you soon. And he says, I planned on keeping this a secret till the day I died. So he very much planned on getting away with it. I mean, that we can see quite clearly. And again, that speaks to this very short-sighted, very immature thinking, that lack of the prefrontal cortex, which would tell any mature adult, the odds are very, very unlikely that you're going to get away with this. In fact, even though I had no idea who had committed this crime in the beginning, my knee-jerk assumption as a psychologist was to assume that this was somebody who wanted to be a martyr, who knew they were going to get caught, essentially, but was doing it for some greater cause. Now, while we start to see that Tyler Robinson had a kind of, quote, greater cause motivation, it really wasn't a greater cause that he was motivated by. It was a personal relationship. And that makes sense for somebody at this stage of development. Okay. So, no, they grabbed some crazy old dude. Kind of ironic considering that he's the one that just assassinated somebody. So, that gives you an indication that he doesn't see himself as crazy, at least not explicitly. But I want you to keep something in mind as we go through this. This might sound complicated, and you might have to take a minute to think about what I'm about to say, but it is so important. So, as a psychological professional, I understand that there are two kind of simultaneous sets of motivations within us. There is how we see ourselves, uh, in the eyes of others, like our behavior that just is very superficial on the surface, why we think we're motivated by something, right? All of that. But then there's the sort of more subconscious motivators. And one way that you can tell how somebody really feels is by the language that they select, even though they're talking about somebody else. So he, on the top of his mind right now, when he answers this question, we see that he's thinking, no, they grabbed some crazy old dude. What that tells us is that internally, on some level he's unaware of, he knows that what he did was crazy. Okay. Now, you might think, Sam, come on, that's psychobabble. Well, that is what my world is, right? This is what I know. This is what I've been trained, and this is how I see everything. So even with my own behavior, I know, and I'll give you a perfect example. Let's say that I'm walking around in the mall and I notice that my eye is going to the hairdo of other people that I'm seeing. And I'm like, oh God, that person's hair is nasty or whatever. I'm judging other people's physical appearance. Well, you can rest assured and absolutely bet that probably earlier that day or sometime in the recent past, I had been thinking, God, I don't like the way I look. I particularly don't like the way my hair looks. You can almost always put your money on that. It's just how we are, right? It's called a recency bias, and it's how we see the world. In truth, right? And my area of particular specialization is perception, why people see the world around them the way that they do. Because we don't all see reality the same way. Obviously, we've had very different life experiences, even though biologically, genetically, we're actually much more similar than you might realize. The truth is that our experience essentially informs our perception, everything, everything. The language that you speak, the family that you are of origin, everything, the culture that you grew up in, all of that informs how you see things. And in this case, what we're seeing is that he very much has crazy on the mind at this moment, which again tells us that he understands on some much deeper level that what he did was crazy. I've also heard people saying that, oh, he was psychotic. Tyler Robinson was in a state of psychosis. While he knows what he did is crazy, because of the fact that we can understand and follow his thinking here, this is not psychosis. Psychosis, we would likely see either paranoia. There'd be no sense he's getting away with it. If anything, he would feel like he's being chased. Oh God, that person looked at me funny. Or you'd be hearing him talk about a higher calling, like he believes that he's, a Jesus or some kind of godlike figure. You might see delusions of grandeur. You might also see really chaotic thinking where we are not able to follow from one sentence to the next what's going on in his mind. It does not make sense. It's all over the place. We're also not getting that. He's making perfect sense, whether we agree with what he's saying or not, and whether we could ever imagine feeling this way, ever thinking it's a good idea to hurt another person, no matter what their belief system. That's not what would make him crazy from a psychological perspective. That's not what would make him psychotic from a professional perspective. That's not what, as a psychological professional, that's nothing that I would look at and say, oh, that's psychosis. Not at all. So this is not evidence of somebody in a state of psychosis. He might try to claim that, but it would fail miserably if we're able to validate these text messages. Okay. So, then it says, I had planned. So you also can see that there's no psychosis because of the way that he says this. Then they interrogated someone in similar clothing. In other words, he's aware of why investigators would be looking for somebody who was wearing the same clothing as he was. That was also on his mind. We know that he changed clothing and he left the clothing that he was in. What does that tell us? That tells us that he was aware he was going to be on video and that he planned for that ahead of time. Okay, so then we see here, he says, I had planned to grab my rifle from the drop point shortly after, but most of that side of town got locked down. So this, again, speaks to two things. One, he thinks he put in planning, but he clearly did not. And we know that, I mean, at least he didn't put in a lot of planning. He couldn't have. It's based on his behavior and the way that he went about this. There really wasn't a lot of careful planning ahead of time, right? There was some forethought, like he left the note, he did change his clothing, he left the gun, but obviously, if you were going to think a lot about this, you would know that all these people on campus, the immediate reaction instantaneously would be to lock down that area, including wherever he left the rifle, right? So in his mind, he starts thinking, all right, well, it's quiet almost enough to get out of the vehicle that he's in, because we find out he's in a car. And then he says, but there is this one vehicle lingering, so he doesn't feel safe enough to get out and go grab the rifle. Okay. So then the roommate says why, and Tyler Robinson clarifies, why did I do it? And again, this is more evidence of someone not psychotic. He's able to answer questions. He's able to infer accurately what the intent of the person he's speaking with is. Okay. So he's not so in his own world, lost in his own world, that he can't follow what the person that he knows well and who he loves might be thinking. So then he says, why did I do it? And he says, yeah. And he said, I had enough of his hatred. This is fascinating, really. So some hate can't be negotiated out. If I am able to grab my rifle, okay, so I had enough of his hatred. Some hate can't be negotiated out. So we're going to stop there and look at that. This is exactly the way a child thinks. And by child, I mean somebody who's not an adult, not 25 or greater. They think that they're acting to eradicate, in this case, hate, right? He's saying he had this cause that felt so important. I have to eradicate this hateful message of Charlie Kirk's. But in actuality, this is about his own feelings of hatred. What he's really saying here is, I had enough of my hatred. And you may think, like, oh, Sam, that's psychobabble. Well, psychobabble or not, from my view, that's just very clear, and it's a very matter-of-fact fact. And you may have different training and experience and knowledge, and you may be really emotional about this, and you want this to be one way or another. I truly am just reading it from how I'm calling it. Whether you agree or not, you are perfectly, and I encourage people not to agree, right? I have somebody who likes learning and values learning more than I do being right. And if you have a difference of opinion with me, I welcome it. Okay, so then he says, some hate can't be negotiated. And this is a rationalization. This is how he's rationalizing this behavior that having murdered somebody, right? And remember, we know he already distanced himself from Charlie Kirk. He made him out to be a thing, not a person, so that he could feel okay about taking this action. So what we see here is that he's motivated by hate. That's his motivation. I had enough of his hatred, which means I've actually had enough of my hatred, feeling so angry and powerless, right? Feeling so much hate and anger, but not being able to do anything about it. And then he says, some hate can't be negotiated out, which is a fascinating also tell as to his motivation. And then it says, if I am able to grab my rifle unseen, I will have left no evidence. So again, he goes back to being singularly focused on the rifle. So he's trying to answer and honor, honestly, his partner by answering the questions, but he's going right back to, I got to get this rifle. And I'll give you my little opinion up front. It would be, you'd have to get the FBI's greatest behavioral analysis team to to put this together, right? Because somebody would really have to understand development. They'd have to understand the kind of psychology of somebody that they have already archetyped as Tyler Robinson's type of psychology, development, a stage of development, the type of personality of somebody who's this immature in their development, the type of hormone, chemical composition, all of that would have had to have been considered beforehand and then factored into these messages. So that's just a little upfront kind of clue as to why I would be very surprised to learn that these were contrived. You would have to be somebody who truly understood behavior, and maybe they do have the world's best behavioral scientists on this, but know that in order to be able to pull these texts off so that they make sense, the way that they do to somebody who does have a professionally trained eye, you would have to be pretty darn good. And that's what this would have been, right? So again, he goes back to, if I'm able to grab my rifle unseen, I will have left no evidence. So again, we see that he's thinking, I'm going to get away with it if I can get that rifle. So then he says, all right, I'm going to attempt to retrieve it again, and hopefully they have moved on. And this too shows you just how short-sighted this guy's thinking is. It's like, this is totally evidence of somebody without a prefrontal cortex, because of course, as adults, we would all be so obviously they haven't moved on. Like, moved on? You just shot and assassinated Charlie Kirk in front of how many thousands of people, and now you're hoping that they just moved on? I mean, it's a little bit absurd, right? And then so clearly we also get from him, and we can see this from just the way he's aware of what they're doing. I don't know if he had, a police radio of some kind, or if he's tracking it on social media, if he's tracking whatever is being put in the news, local news. But now he says, I haven't seen anything about them finding it. So clearly he is watching to see what investigators, what the police, what's being stated as this investigation is unfolding. All right. So now we see the roommate asks, how long have you been planning this? And Robbins says a bit over a week, I believe. That tells me that's not true. Because he says, I believe, I'm pretty certain this is not true. This is a deception. To me, that makes sense that he would be lying about this, because it does not appear like he's thought about this much at all. And again, we know that he felt urgency because he's told us that he felt like he had an opportunity that he had to take. So my guess is this has really only been a day or two maximum of planning. And then he says, I can get close to the rifle. So again, he's going back to the rifle. And like I said, you'd have to be a brilliant behavioral scientist to know that this would be going on in his mind, because once we understand the full context of the importance of this rifle, it does make sense that he would be singularly focused on it, not just because it would be like the way he would escape getting caught, but because we find out what its significance was to him. And the rifle is also what gets him caught very quickly. So, he says, I can get close to it, but there's a squad car parked right by it. Duh, right? So what does that tell you? Do you think that squad car may have been there for a reason? Hint, hint, maybe. So then he says, I think they already swept that spot, but I don't want to chance it. So we see he's going back and forth in his own mind about whether to get out and go check for the rifle. But now he's starting to feel regret, because now the realization that if they did already sweep it and they already got it, oh no, I might actually get caught for this. That's starting to, right now he's starting to experience some regret. I'm wishing I had circled back and grabbed it as soon as I got to my vehicle, right? Like, shit, I messed up. I'm worried what my old man would do if I didn't bring back Grandpa's rifle. So now we learn that, oh no, right? I used my grandpa's rifle and I'm in trouble now, right? I'm worried about what my dad's going to think about my grandpa's rifle. You also note the language grandpa. That's a child's way of speaking about their grandparent. Once you get older, you might say grandfather, or maybe to other family members or, very close friends, you might use the language grandpa, but that's the way a child speaks about their grandparent. And This is a child. I mean, this is someone who's extraordinarily immature. We see that all over these text messages. I mean, up and down. And of course, not to mention the fact that he actually thought this was a good idea to begin with. These are all things that tell you this is a child being motivated by really strong emotions. Okay. So, but now he's saying, and again, it shows you there was no careful planning or forethought, because only now, after the fact, is he interested in grandpa's rifle. Now, imagine when you've ever gotten in your life, particularly when you were younger, singularly focused, like let's say you were interested in a love partner, you had a crush on somebody. It just controls your thinking. That's all you think about. You don't think about the consequences. You don't think about other people in your life. You're not thinking about who you might hurt or not hurt. You're just thinking about getting what you want. So we see that probably for the last few days, Tyler Robinson has been singularly focused, like a child would be, on getting what he wanted, to executing this task because he felt like there was urgency. And now we see, that task has been executed, which has given him a second to think, oh shit, what are the consequences? And that's happening in real time. And one of the big ones for him is my grandpa's rifle. I don't know if it had a serial number. I don't think it did. I don't know if IDEK means I don't think it did. I'm not sure what IDEK, you probably know. I don't. Let me know in the comments. But it does say, we also find out later it did not have a serial number because of whatever kind of rifle it was. But so he's thinking, okay, they're not going to be able to trace it to me because it didn't have a serial number. But it was like a very unique rifle, apparently, right? And I'm not a gun person, but I understand that it was a very, very unique rifle. So he says, I worry about prints. All of a sudden, he's worried about prints. Again, think about this. If he had planned this for a week, do you think he would have worn gloves? Maybe just a thought. Okay. I worry about prints. I had to leave it in a bush where I changed outfits. Okay. Again, remember, earlier in this conversation, he was so careful about not wanting to say anything incriminating in the texts. Now we've got beyond a full confession. Now we've got, intricate details of his thinking, and he's just not thinking about the consequences. It's very clear he never calculated he was going to get caught. I mean, if one thing jumps out about all these texts, this kid did not think about getting caught. And because we know he did not take a week to think about this, or probably more than a couple of days at max, we can extrapolate, honestly, yeah, of course, he didn't think about that. He just figured, I'm not going to get caught. Yep, I'm smarter than everybody else. Right. What do we know about adolescence? Invincibility. It's a central feature in that time in our development. It's the time in our lives where, from an evolutionary perspective, it's about taking chances. It's about risk taking, because it's very much about a time when we're trying to figure out who we are. And so we are prone to taking risks and to doing stupid things during that time in life. Right? That's how making mistakes is how we figure out what we want in life. Most people know what they don't want before they know what they do want. So this whole setup makes perfect sense with the way he's thinking about getting caught, not getting caught. Now he becomes worried about the immediate consequences, not from law enforcement, right? And again, that global perspective, the ability to think outside of oneself and one's immediate experience, comes later in life. That's adulthood. Childhood, we're only seeing things from our little world, and that includes who? Our lovers or friends, our best friends, our social group, and of course, our parents, our grandparents. So the regret that he's experiencing isn't about getting caught as much as it is about dad's going to be pissed and grandpa's not going to get his rifle, or grandpa's going to be so mad he doesn't get his rifle back, right? So now he's starting to think, okay, I worry about prints. I had to leave it in a bush where I changed outfits. I didn't have the ability or time to bring it with. I might have to abandon it, just leave it and hope they don't find prints. And now he starts thinking about the consequences to him personally. How the will I explain losing it to my old man? It's like, you didn't think about this ahead of time? What are you, just brain dead, right? Well, no, we're all a little brain dead when we're young. I mean, that's just a biological, physiological fact of reality. And so this tracks with the kind of brain dead very specifically that we are at this developmental stage in life. So again, if you were going to generate these text messages, if you were going to sit down and create them, they may not make sense to you, but from a person who understands physiology, development, adolescence, young adulthood, and a fully mature adult brain, boy, these text messages really are exactly what you would expect to see from that person at that stage of life. Then it says, only thing I left was the rifle wrapped in a towel. Okay. So again, now we see that he's starting to shift into thinking about the consequences, which of course makes sense because now that he's executed what was his singular, very obtuse thinking, I got to get this done. I got to get this done. I got to get this done. Now he's executed that. That's over. And that was all driven by emotion, which of course clouds our judgment. If you've been listening to me at all, you know that emotion clouds our best thinking. Right? That's how things like road rage happen. That's how, right after we saw, for example, 9/11, the attack on the Trade Center, all of these young men went in droves and they wanted to fight, right? They wanted to go to Afghanistan and they wanted to fight for their country. Makes sense, but that's all driven by emotion, right? I'm not judging that behavior. I'm just explaining it. All right, so we move on to our next. So now he says, remember how I was engraving bullets? The effing messages are mostly a big meme. If I see notices bulge UW on Fox News, I might have a stroke. All right. Again, you just assassinated Charlie Kirk. You don't think you're going to see the engravings on Fox News? You might think, oh, this is BS. Of course, these are contrived. Well, they seem contrived because it's unbelievable to think that someone could be this stupid, but it's really not stupidity. It's a maturity. It's a developmental immaturity. Okay. It's the type of very childish thinking that you're going to find who is in the throes of emotion, and it's not martyrdom, meaning it's not about social political stuff. I know it sounds like it's political, and we're going to get to that in a moment. Okay, so then he makes the decision, I'm going to leave it, and that really effing sucks. So now there's this awareness that like, oh God, they have the rifle. They could find a way through Prince to trace it back to me. Okay, so now there's the first thought, and we really see that this is like the first moment where this guy factors in the reality that he could get caught, which is just amazing, right? It's like, what? How could he think that? How could he have not considered that? Well, when you've not given yourself more than a day or two to think about doing something, that urgency, that adrenaline of urgency, I got to do it now, kicks in, and you're singularly focused based on emotion without that developed prefrontal cortex. This makes sense. And now we see evidence of radicalized thinking and depersonalization. And this is what I was speaking to at the very beginning of this video. When we are this immature, this emotional, this hormonal, this protective over somebody that we love, and then you add a community, maybe an online community, where you hear people spewing a lot of anger, spewing a lot of hateful messages, and it starts to become front of mind in your perception of the way things are, then it starts to feel normalized. It starts to seem like everybody else agrees with me. Yeah, this side is bad. Yeah, those people aren't even human. And we've seen this throughout the history of time. So this is nothing new, nothing even close to new. This is how terrorist organizations would do their recruiting. Look for immature, fragile, angry folks and start the grooming process. And this young man would have been, because of his personal circumstances, perfectly positioned for this type of thinking and this type of inevitable conclusion. And now we see what to me is just an just abhorrent statement. Judging from today, I'd say Grandpa's gun does just fine, right? Like, what kind of unimaginable horror is going on in this guy that this is how he feels about Charlie Kirk? He's so upset about whatever he thinks Charlie Kirk represents, because it's not, my guess is that this is not someone who sat around listening to Charlie Kirk all day, right? If you have opposing beliefs to somebody, it's very unlikely that you sit around listening to their message because it's so upsetting. It creates too much an overflow and an overwhelm emotionally. And so most people don't watch the opposition's, spokespeople, leaders. If you're, progressive, you're not watching Fox News every morning. And conversely, if you're someone who's watching Fox News every morning, you're probably not watching Rachel Maddow, right? Like, it's just a fact. That's just not how we are. It's also how, in this social media system, how people become kind of more and more polarized because they just keep giving their attention to what they believe instead of trying to kind of look at opposing viewpoints and weigh different opinions without emotion playing a role. So we see here that he is very crass, callous, hardened, and distanced from thinking of Charlie Kirk as a person, which tracks with text we saw earlier, right? I had an opportunity to take out somebody that's actively putting distance between you and another person so that it makes it easier to hurt them. So then he goes back to the rifle. I think this was a $2,000 scope, speaking about the effectiveness of the shot, which is just, again, horrifying. Now he's starting to think about getting caught. So now we see him saying to the partner, delete the exchange, because now there's a fear, oh God, I might get caught. And again, how could he not have considered that already? But he didn't. Now his father has texted him. So now all these images are out there, and they have obviously put out images of the rifle, and dad recognizes it. So he says, my dad wants photos of the rifle. He says, grandpa wants to know who has it. So of course, if Tyler Robinson was not guilty of this, then sure, okay, I'll send dad a pic of the rifle. But of course he is. So now Tyler Robinson knows that he's guilty of this. So now, of course, Tyler Robinson knows dad knows he's guilty of this, and he knows he's caught. The feds released a photo of the rifle, and it is very unique. So you see, this guy never considered, oh shit, there's going to be pictures of the shooter with a very unique rifle, so it could be immediately traced back to me. Instead, he's thinking about serial numbers. So he went to the extent to change his clothing and leave it behind the tree, but he did not consider that the rifle and images of it would immediately lead back to him, right? Unbelievable. So he says, he's calling me right now. I'm not answering. And this is a really important statement. This statement is why a lot of people don't think that these texts are valid, but I'm going to explain to you why that is not necessarily the case. So he says, since Trump got into office, my dad has been pretty diehard MAGA. Now, while you might look at that and say, of course, this is the feds intentionally trying to say that this, to prove this kid was liberal, whatever. The truth is that for him, for Tyler Robinson, this was not about politics, okay? It was not about politics. How do we know? Because if this is the first time that Tyler Robinson has ever outed himself as his father being MAGA, we know that he couldn't have been openly motivated by politics. But if I am Tyler Robinson, I have fallen in love with my trans roommate. Think about it. Would you want that person to know that your dad was diehard MAGA? If you feel shame because you've fallen in love with this person, your roommate, would you want them to know that inside of me, right, is my father? Because that's how kids think. You see, before we go on to maybe start our own families or get older and further from childhood, and definitely through the age 25 and beyond, our identity is still primarily formed either in lieu of our family of origin or against, right? So we still feel very connected to that family of origin, even if we don't embody it, right? Do you see what I mean? Most people either identify with how they were raised, who their parents taught them to be, the beliefs, the culture, all of that, or they actively push against it as a rebellion. This is how we formulate who we are. This is just standard operating procedure through adolescence and young adulthood. It's just what everybody goes through, right? So it makes sense that Tyler Robinson would have felt shame and would not have told his partner that he has a father who's MAGA until now, right? Until this circumstance. And what that tells us, though, is that this was not an advocate. This was not somebody who was showing up at like the local, branch of the Democratic Party. This was somebody who was motivated by personal conflict because he did not tell this person who he's actively falling for or fallen for that his dad has a belief system that goes against the behavior that he's doing, or at least in Tyler Robinson's mind. Who the hell knows what his father believes? I mean, if he's diehard MAGA, does that mean he's anti-trans? Maybe, could be, maybe there's a good chance, but we don't know that for sure. We haven't spoken to dad, right? So we don't know that for sure, but we know that for Tyler Robinson, that's what it means. That's why he wouldn't have told him. So while I understand that it's like, oh, come on, they only, the feds wrote this in, whatever. I get that thinking. But again, if we're thinking straight psychology, this makes sense because would you want your partner to know that this is how your dad felt? Now, why wouldn't you want your partner to know what your dad's politics are? Well, here's the thing. If I had been raised with someone who has strong beliefs about homosexuality, about people who identify as trans, and that person is vocal about those beliefs, you can bet that as a person with an immature brain and feeling all of these extreme emotions, I am going to have one hell of a time entering into a relationship with somebody who presents as a biological male and is in the middle of transitioning into becoming a woman. And that is just a fact. So this motivation would not be driven in the name of the world being a better place shaped in the likeness of what I think the world should look like, but specifically motivated by internal conflicts, a feeling of needing to protect this person that I love, and specifically scapegoating, putting all of my anger in a place that's safer than at my father or my family. And then lastly, we hear, I'm going to turn myself in willingly. One of my neighbors here is a deputy for the sheriff. Now, I wish we had the timeline of these messages. I didn't actively look for the time sequence. I probably could go back and do that. But my sense is, just from reading these, that there was likely some gaps in time between some of these messages because he would have had to, at one point, stopped and spoke to the neighbor, spoke to the family. And I know that on the parents' side, they had actively asked him to reach out to this friend who they had felt Tyler Robinson would listen to and trusted. Okay. And then finally, we get a really interesting last few messages. Robinson says, "You are all I worry about, love." And then his roommate and partner says, "I'm worried more about you." And okay, let's take a look at that. So again, my thinking here is that this is very personal for Tyler Robinson. This was not political, it was personal. But if you are somebody who's very conflicted because dad has a message that you interpret, I'm not saying anything about the father, that Tyler Robinson interprets as being anti-gay or anti-trans, and then he falls in love with his roommate who is trans, you can see that there would be very serious inner conflict. And for a very immature, physiological, hormonal human being, it makes sense because they don't have a fully developed frontal cortex that they would think, oh, I know, here's an opportunity for me to act this out. So the other thing that happens to biological males at this age is they become very protective. Testosterone makes them feel protective, makes them feel almost territorial, right? So protection would be front of mind. So now you have this young man who feels crazy love for this person, his roommate, his partner, who is trans, who he wants to protect and feels great concern and care for. And he doesn't think this through, completely consumed with emotion, makes the choice. I know I will eliminate the problem by, quote, taking out a spokesperson for the message of hate against trans people, right? It is very childish, it's very immature, and it's very short-sighted because as an adult, I can see that this isn't gonna eradicate that message. Obviously, it's in fact, if anything, more likely to inflame folks who believe that, right? You've just essentially made the problem exponentially worse by making a murder of Charlie Kirk. Honestly, I don't know that Charlie Kirk had a message of, strong hate to trans. I don't know Charlie Kirk's message. So I don't know one way or the other. He may have, he may not have. I'm not here to speak on that. I can only tell you what this guy thought based on these texts, what Tyler Robinson thought, right? And how do we know that? Because he is telling us, you are all I worry about, love, which means he's feeling protective over a person who he feels is in danger. And the reason that he thinks he's in danger is because of an anti-trans message. And in his mind, whether he listens to Charlie Kirk or even knows who he is, that's somebody he saw as a spokesperson for that message. Again, it's very obtuse. It's very black and white. The kind of thinking that's either or. People fit into nice boxes. They're this way or that way. Of course, nobody fits into a nice box. Human beings are quite complex. We can have all kinds of beliefs that do not necessarily fit together from an objective perspective, certainly from an outsider's perspective. So this is short-sighted. It is incredibly limited thinking. It is not it is void of the ability to think globally, to think in complex terms about the world, about human beings, and to have forethought, to think 10 steps ahead about what the effects of his actions are going to be. He's not thinking that. And that makes sense because he wouldn't be capable of that at this age, right? So now, after we already know that this is somebody who did not think he was going to get caught, which is like mind-boggling to any fully mature adult, how could you not think that? Then he tells his lover, his partner, his roommate, don't talk to the media, please. Don't take any interviews or make any comments. If any police ask you questions, ask for a lawyer and stay silent. So now he's reconciled. All right, I guess I'm going to turn myself in. And the last message to his partner is, stay quiet. And that makes sense because, again, we have just learned from his own words, he's worried about the safety of his partner. So he wouldn't want it to come out that this is the lover of someone who is trans, particularly if he's worried that the message that he appears to think connected to MAGA is an anti-trans message, which we can extrapolate from his behavior and from his words here in these text messages, right? So hopefully that helps people to understand purely from a psychological perspective how one might read these texts, not as a political statement, but as a personal conflict that a person of developmental immaturity who does not have the skill set or the capacity yet for long-term planning to manage the impulses that he's experiencing. There's a sense of increase. The biggest influx of testosterone a young male is ever going to feel is around this age. So that's the ultimate time in life to want to protect others. That's why, again, young men will take up arms for their country, right? To protect the people that they love, to protect this thing that they love. It's a time where people become more patriotic often, particularly if there's some kind of a threat. It's also a time when, younger males are likely to get into bar fights because somebody looks at their, significant other the wrong way. Oftentimes, heterosexual men, right? They'll protect their female partner because they don't want other guys threatening them or her. So these are the stereotypes, but they happen for a reason at this age. That's the point. The combination of hormones, neurochemistry, and development makes these text messages make sense. If this was going to be fabricated by the Trump administration to put this on trans people, then my guess would have been it would have been political. It would have been messages like, screw Trump and fuck those MAGA people and screw those conservatives. Like, it would have been more explicitly political, but that's not what this is. You, of course, are going to have whatever beliefs you want, and I honor them, and I actually encourage them. If you disagree with me, please let me know why. I am always open to debate. In fact, I encourage it. If you want to even set up a conversation, a live stream, a debate, I encourage that also. But from a psychological perspective, that is what I see. And I just don't see, unless somebody went to the behavioral science unit and said, you guys contrive text messages. And not only that, these texts came out very quickly. So somebody with a very incredible understanding of human behavior, human psychology, human physiology would have had to very quickly come up with these texts and exactly be able to sort of frame this in a personalized way, not in a political framework, because this is not political for this guy. It is personal. It is about a personal conflict between his feelings, the way he was raised, the way he was taught to believe, and personal experience with a roommate who he clearly has fallen head over heels for and has a lot of conflicted ideas about, as we see because of the bullets. He's actually making gay slang jokes on engraved bullets. To me, this is a young man who is trying to reconcile one way that he was taught to think, one way that he was taught to believe, with very strong feelings that directly contradict with the belief system of that he was taught, right? Certainly, that does not result in assassinating another human being. There's no excuse for any of this. It is disgraceful. It is disgusting. But from a purely physiological and psychological perspective, you could see what this kid is thinking and feeling, and it does make logical, linear sense from that perspective. Because if you understand all those factors, you could see how this very troubled man came to this conclusion. And when you add that urgency, oh God, I got to do it right now, right? And that short-sighted thinking, that inability to plan down the line, and that surge of emotion to protect this person that he loves and he feels afraid for, you combine what we call displacement, what we call projection, what we call rationalization, what we call depersonalization in psychology. You combine all these factors with physiological developmental stages in life, and it really does make a whole lot of sense that these text messages are indeed real. Now, take that for what you will. You do not have to agree with me, but that is what my training and expertise tells me. Okay, I hope that was helpful to somebody somewhere. I hope you understand. If you have questions, you feel free to email, to comment them to me. I am happy to try to answer them. And again, there's no excuse for violence ever. It is disgusting what has happened here. I personally believe it to be the most abhorrent act, and I do not believe it to be ever an acceptable behavior, not for any reason, not at any time. So thank you so much for your time, your effort, your attention, and I will see you again soon.
It is the defense counselor's duty to protect the rights of the individual, as it is the prosecution's duty to uphold and defend the laws of the state. Justice for all. Only we have a problem here.
I live inside my own world of make-believe. Kids screaming in the cradles, profanities. I see the world through eyes covered in ink and bleach. Cross out the ones who heard my cries and watched me weep. I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe, but that's alright.